Good morning.
I'm back. Anyway, we are beginning to delve into the story of Israel as we move through the fall, getting ready for Christmas. We are going to move from the primordial time all the way through to the 1st century AD, into which Jesus was born. Now, in order to do that, I have to use the H word, which I know you don't like, history. But it is part of our understanding of what 1st century Jews thought would happen when the Messiah came, the world into which Jesus was born, and also helps us to understand how Jesus saw himself. So, last week Ben talked to you about eels and exile. Eels, election, Exodus, land, sin, and then of course exile. You have a handout on your table, and it gives you, first off, what I call probably dating. It is impossible, unlike the Declaration of Independence, okay, which we can peg July 4th, 1776. Or, unlike the reign of Henry VIII, which we can peg from 1507 to 1547. Some of these events that we're going to discuss cannot be nailed down in terms of years. So these are probable datings, and sometimes they overlap. And that's in large part because we just don't have a firm date. These are the areas that we're going to be talking about over the course of this fall. The patriarchs, the sojourn and the bondage in Egypt, the wanderings after the Exodus, the settlement of Canaan, the tribal configuration, the united monarchy, the divided kingdom, the exile, I should say the divided kingdoms, the exile, and then the post-exile. There are some key points that we must keep in mind. There is no one beginning to the Old Testament. Second thing is, the Old Testament does not allow us to make saints out of its heroes. The Old Testament heroes will show us weaknesses, depravities, and boldness. So, let's talk a little bit about the time of the patriarchs. Now, scholars estimate that to be 2000 to 1500 BC. The stories of the patriarchs arose around campfires. In other words, the Hebrew people, as they wandered, were told the story of their father Abraham and of his children and their children. And so at night, people would sit around the campfire as they wandered and hear the stories. These stories were also told later on at the gate. Once the Hebrew people arrived in the Promised Land and began to build up small tent communities, there was always an entrance to that community, which was the place where the elders sat down to ensure that the tribe, the community, took care of each other. And that is always called in the Old Testament at the gate. And so the elders would also sit at the gate, and they would tell the same stories about Father Abraham and his sons, and his grandsons, and his great-grandsons. All these stories were told to provide identity, to ensure that future generations, 500, 1,000 years later, knew that they were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, this time, Abraham was called by God. In other words, he was elected. He was called to leave his land. Elections, or calls, are about leaving. We must be careful not to think that when somebody is elected in the Old Testament, when somebody is called, they're elected or called to stay right where they are. That is never the case when you read about a call in the Old Testament. Even if what they're called to do is go up to the city and tell the king what he's doing wrong, they're still being called to leave where they are. We will see this again when we look at the New Testament. The disciples were not called to stay by their fishing boat or to stay in Galilee. Called to leave. Abraham raised many children. Genesis 15 tells us this. Your descendants will be like the stars in the heavens. And every one of his children and their children, we see in Genesis, were called, were elected to leave. In the story of Jacob, his family was driven into Egypt because of the famine, leaving their land, an exodus from their home. And if my memory is correct, one of the maps that you have back here is, I'm sorry, I didn't print it. I did not print it. I printed, unfortunately, 2 of Abraham's journeys. But this whole thing about being called to leave your land, if you look at the first map, marked Abraham's journeys, he started in Ur of the Chaldeans, which is today's Iraq, and he meandered. Now, we might look at that and say that's not that much, but when you're meandering on foot with everything you own on your back, that's a lot of wandering. Jacob's family, as I said, was driven into Egypt. And if you look at the map right below that, it gives you an idea of the kind of wandering Jacob's family had to do. All of his descendants, all of Abraham's descendants lived off the land. Land was important. But they were also called to declare God's presence in the land. They were called to represent God in the land in which they found themselves. And then we also have to remember that in all of these stories, the story of the apple, the story of Cain and Abel, the story of the flood, the story of Hagar, the story of Esau and Jacob, the story of Tamar, the story of Joseph and his brothers. In every one of those stories, we must always remember that sin abounded. So there was election, there was exodus, there was movement, there was land, but in all of these stories, sin is present. And sin will come up over and over and over again in the story of Israel. Last point about this period is, and it's very important, there is no archaeological evidence that the folks of the patriarchal and or the primordial period did not exist. Okay? So we can't say that Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, Leah, Rachel, Joseph, etc. are made-up characters. But we can't say that they didn't live at some period in time. What's more important is the lives that they lived and how those lives manifest God in the land in which they found themselves. So, eventually, the Hebrew people found themselves on a sojourn and bondage in Egypt. This, of course, came after Joseph and his whole family moved to Egypt because of the famine. The time in Egypt is another time of election and land. Moses, as we heard in the Old Testament lesson 2 or 3 Sundays ago, Moses was called, was elected while he was in Egypt. Generally speaking, God's call to people tends to kind of take one of 2 forms. The first is a conversation between the deity and the agent involved. The second form of a call, an election from God, is that God rounds up the heavenly hosts to convey the message. As we talk about election over the course of the fall, we will see a little of both kinds of calls. In the case of Moses and the story of the burning bush, it is the first type of call, a conversation between the deity and the agent. You may remember that God confronted Moses in the burning bush, and he offered some words of introduction to him. He issued a commission to Moses. I want you to go to Pharaoh. Moses objected. You couldn't possibly mean me. God reassured him that he did indeed mean him. And here's the sign. Because remember, when Moses objected, he asked, what should I tell Moses? Who should I tell him is sending me? And the sign that he gave him is, you tell him that I am who I am sent you. Now, if you want to think about an incomplete, unhelpful answer in the presence of a burning bush, equally weird, that had to have been it for poor Moses. In the Hebrew world, names have power, and this is very true throughout the history of the Old Testament. It is equally true today. Most people with a Hebrew name, especially if they're an Orthodox Jew, can probably tell you what their name means in a way that we've lost that ability. Names have power, and to know God's name is to have power. Yahweh said, I am who I am, but it could also mean, I will be who I will be. In God's name, the verb to be has a quality of action. You see, when we say, I am standing in front of you, it doesn't necessarily convey to us that I'm doing something. But when God says, I am who I am, I will be who I will be, He is saying, I do things. I make things happen. I cause to be what will be. The name of God is Yahweh. And it is generally abbreviated in that way. Those are the, as it says on your handout, those are the Hebrew letters Yah, Heh, Wah, Heh. I think that's, it's on your handout. This whole thing is called a tetragrammaton. It just means, in Greek, 4 letters. That's all it means. Should be on the first page of your handout, okay? In Hebrew, there are no vowels. It only has consonants. And the pronunciation is somewhat sing-song. If you know anything about Japanese, the Japanese language is somewhat sing-song. So therefore, when Hebrew gets transliterated into Western letters, they often will do this to help us to figure out how to pronounce that. Hence, we get Yahweh. Now, Moses is told to go to his people, go to Pharaoh, then he's told to lead his people out of Egypt.
Can I just say something interesting about the whole burning bush thing?
Yeah.
Because I think that that's meant to convey also something important about God. That God, the bush is not burning.
It's not consumed.
Right.
Right.
Well, if the fire, it's like the fire's in the bush, but the bush is untouched by it.
Mm-hmm.
So God's not the bush is the point.
Right.
That in just in conveying that simple image, what's being communicated is this is not a pantheistic religion. This is not a polytheistic religion. This is a monotheistic, creational monotheism religion, where God is the creator of everything and is separate from his creation, but intimately involved with it, intimately connected with it.
Mm-hmm.
He's not separate, he's not aloof, he's not off somewhere else, he's present here.
And this will come up in some of the calls that we will talk about as we go through, like the call of like Elijah, and the still small voice, and various others. Okay, so what is the Exodus? Moses is told to lead his people out. What is it? The Exodus is a gift from God. It is grace. It is land. Because of the Exodus, the Hebrew people know Yahweh to be their Savior. They know that God liberates them. And we cannot underestimate the centrality of the Exodus to the Hebrew people. It will exceed all time. They'll tell the stories of Abraham and his descendants, but they will also tell the story of the Exodus and what God did. And because they will tell that over and over again, there will be a strong belief that God can do this again. Indeed, if you look in Luke's gospel at the Passion and the Resurrection, he sees that as the new Exodus. The Exodus gives images of God as a leader, as a physician, as a healer, as a provider, and as a victor. And what will be interesting as we go forward to 0 BC, 0 AD, is to see how some of those images, all of which you can find in the Exodus, get obscured. And by the time that Jesus comes, to be able to see how the Hebrew people get to a point where the victor God of the Exodus becomes so key to what they are expecting. There is movement in the Exodus, and it is movement from the grace of the Exodus. And grace here, same understanding that we have in the New Testament, an unmerited gift. There's movement in the Exodus from grace to law. A law that will be freely chosen by the Hebrew people in Exodus 20. I think it's next Sunday's reading is Exodus 20, if my memory is correct. The law that the Hebrew people are given specifies the covenantal relationship which they are free to choose. The law was given because it was a good device, not bad. Obey the law because you're saved. Obey the law because it's a gift from God. One of the interesting things about the law as God gave it is negative law gives greater freedom. Think about it. In the garden, God said, you can do whatever you want, you can eat anything you want, just don't eat from that tree. Just don't eat from one tree. You have the entire garden to play in. You have the entire garden to be at home in. Just don't eat from that tree. Same thing with the law which the Hebrew people would be given. Thou shalt not have any other gods before me. Trust in me. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. You got a wife. You got a husband. Beautiful, handsome. You don't need any more. Thou shalt not. It sounds funny in our lives thousands of years after the law was given, but negative law actually gives us greater freedom. Freedom to realize that there's a lot that we can do. Just this one particular thing that we're not supposed to do. So, the law is given during the time of the wanderings. And the Israelites, the Hebrew people, we are told, wandered for 40 years. Now, how do we know this? How can I say to you on your handout that the wanderings were 1290 to 1250? Well, there is archaeological evidence to peg those dates. I don't care if it was 1291 to 1251. There's archaeological evidence to peg that period of time as the wandering through the desert. The number 40, it's symbolic. Don't get hung up on whether it was 39 or 42. The point is that this was time of the Hebrew people wandering in the land. And remember, we said that in the land, they were to represent the presence of God. Well, they had some interesting ways of showing the presence of God. As we continue reading through Exodus over the next few Sundays, they were full of conflict. They were forever in some kind of conflict, whether it was the golden calf or whatever, they were in conflict. They were forever complaining. Why did you bring us here?
And Moses was complaining.
And Moses...
They're my people, they're your people.
Right. They are not mine.
God. No priest has ever said that.
Being the Jones interpretation. And there were challenges, of course, to Moses. Well, maybe we should have another leader. You don't know what you're doing. And to God, wait a minute. You gave us those flakes yesterday, that's all we get for food? Can't you do any better than that?
You should say what manna means. Manna means what is it?
What is it? Thank you. That's what the Hebrew word...
Manna from heaven, the bread from heaven, it means
what is it? And don't think...
Tastes like chicken.
Don't go thinking of some nice artisan loaf of bread from Hannaford's or Market Basket. I mean, literally, it was flakes, crumbs. Hence, what is it? But it filled them. Okay? The Exodus was also a time of exile. They weren't in Egypt anymore, which they made perfectly clear. You know, Moses, things were pretty good back there. We had 3 squares, had a tent over our head. But they weren't wherever they were going, wherever that may have been. From this Exodus from this exile from Egypt, a nation would emerge that would be governed by laws under a covenant.
Karen,
Yes.
pillar of cloud by day, fire by night. I think it's important.
Yes, sorry. In the wanderings, in the land, the presence of God was seen because there was always a pillar of fire.
Pillar of cloud by day.
Pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. In other words, protection in the wandering during the day and the ability to see what they're doing at night.
And God is present in leading them.
Leading, absolutely.
to the land.
If next week for the 8 o'clockers, look up the hymn 522. For the rest of you, when you go in there, look up the hymn 522. You know it. It's glorious things of thee are spoken. And look through the verses, because all of that language about the pillar of cloud and the fire by night is right in the middle of the hymn. Okay? God present with his people, even in the midst of complaints, conflicts, and challenges. God hasn't disappeared. So they come to Canaan, the promised land. The promised land was chosen for the Hebrew people, not by the Hebrew people. Or as Golda Meir used to like to say 40 years ago, Moses wandered all over the Middle East and he had to land in the one place that had no oil. Yeah.
I just have a question.
Don't ask me how many points.
No.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have a feeling I'll get picked on that for a long time. But does it, and my memory is probably pretty cloudy, but in Moses' Exodus, was there somewhere in there that they said that they kept circling around the same area? Or something to that effect? Or was that just like, not what they actually did, but because all the area was familiar?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. The map on the last, I think it's the next to last page of your handout, suggests that their wandering took them around the Sinai Peninsula. On any given day, they could have been going in circles. But I don't really know the answer to that. It was 40 years. Anything's possible. But obviously, their belief in God wasn't dictated by whether at times they were going in circles. And the fact that they kept telling the story was not being affected by whether or not people did tell stories about going around in circles.
Just one more thing about that.
Mm-hmm.
Also, during the wilderness wanderings, there was what was called the tent of meeting. And that's a precursor for the temple. And in the tent of meeting, wherever they would be encamped, they would set up the tent of meeting, and there was 2 chambers in the tent. The inner chamber was where Moses would go to consult the Almighty. The outer chamber is where the elders and Moses would get together to talk and lead.
Chuck.
Also the point, though, that the 40 years is not as important as the fact that God made them stay in the wilderness until the Exodus generation had died, and their children, only their children would enter the promised land. That's
Yeah.
part of the repercussions for the disobedience.
Right.
Yes.
That's a good point.
Very good point.
That the sin that's present throughout this story has consequences. And one of the consequences of the ongoing rebellion of God's people, even after they've been saved so graciously, was that no one who left Egypt ever made it to the Promised Land, including
Moses.
But you got to see it.
He got to see it.
Yes,
Right.
The spies got to see it.
Well, no, Moses was in Deuteronomy 34. Moses is given a vision. He has the chance to see the Promised Land, and then he dies. So, chosen for the Hebrew people, not by the Hebrew people. And as Ben just said, it is a gift from God. It is a gift from God who, with his mighty hand and his outstretched arm, has performed signs and wonders for the Hebrew people over and over again. And here's one more big one. It's not that they deserve it. It is a gift. And they are to obey God's voice and keep his commands. It is important for us to also realize that at this point in time, this is not about nationalism. So whatever you do, when I say they've gotten to the Promised Land, do not think of this as the nationalism of Israel today. Don't think of this as Zionism from the Israel of 75, 90 years ago. Don't get any of those images. What we have here are 12 loosely connected tribes and their assorted descendants. What we have here is chaotic. It lacks organization. And we also have to bear in mind, and this is of major importance, that there are others who have stakes in the land that God has given them. And the last map on your page is not the one that I wanted to put up. I wanted to put up the map of who had stakes in the, well, actually some of it is here, but it's the divided kingdom. It was the wrong map. The Philistines have a stake in the land. The Canaanites have a stake. The Amorites, the Edomites, whole assortment of tribes that have stakes in the land that the Hebrew people have been given. Now, small footnote, how did they get into the land? Well, was there a major confrontation? Did Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho? It made for a great spiritual, back on the plantations. It probably helped a lot of people cope with the life that they were living back in the early part of the 1800s. But as best we can tell, Joshua never fit the Battle of Jericho. As a matter of fact, the walls of Jericho were probably much more like breastworks that you would find in a Civil War battlefield. In other words, a mound. Or, bad example perhaps, but if you've seen that Geico commercial where the Huns are trying to get into China and they come up and there's this wall that is about 2 feet high and they look, how do we get across? And finally one guy goes and steps over, and the point is the Great Wall wasn't as great as they thought. All right, getting into the Promised Land was probably a little bit like that. There is the story of Rahab, who gave protection to the spies, but Joshua and Judges don't completely agree on this, but all indications archaeologically are that the Hebrew people got into the land with a gradual infiltration. In Judges 1, they do make reference to a long series of campaigns of encroachment into the land. They fought the Canaanites and various other groups to get into that land. And when you get into the book of Judges, you find that the Hebrew people are beginning to talk about how we need a leader to deal with all of these other people who are in the land. That brings us to this time of what I'm calling tribal confederation. It was a time when they were always threatened by the Canaanites and then by the Philistines. It was also the time of the judges. The Israelites would raise up, call, elect from their own someone who would be the judge over Israel. Anybody remember who one of the most famous judges was? Bingo. Samson. And remember how I said sin abounds? Well, Samson was as flawed as he could be. Great judge, but like all human beings, flawed. Another judge was Gideon. At the time of the judges, towards the end of the time of the judges, the Philistines became a major problem. And the Philistines knew how to get under the skin of the Israelites. They would encroach on their encampment and steal the ark. Now, the cloud by day and the light by night, all of those symbols of God, the tent of meeting, by the time of the judges, that had all been encapsulated in the Ark of the Covenant. Where the Ark was, there was God. And the Ark moved all over the Promised Land. If the Canaanites were threatening over here, take the Ark, God will be there. When the Philistines are threatening, take the Ark, God will be there. Leanne?
Stupid question.
No, none of those.
What is the ark? Is it a boat?
No.
No, I want you to,
Indiana Jones.
that's what I was going to say. Move forward. Same word.
Piece of something?
No, it's a box.
It's a box, okay.
Seriously, go back to Indiana Jones, the first movie.
Okay.
Okay? And remember that big gold thing that took, 4 or 8 men to carry?
Okay.
That's what it looked like. There you go.
And it had 2 poles
Oh, okay.
that went through it, and then this was the lid.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and the top of the ark was called the mercy seat. And God
Sat.
It was very uncomfortable.
Worse than a bicycle seat.
On the mercy seat. And inside the Ark of the Covenant was the 10 Commandments.
Okay. Okay.
That was actually a good...
Cherubim on top of the ark, yes.
Right.
Cherubim, it's also, cherubim means some angelic figures, but it was also called the mercy seat.
And actually, I'm glad you brought that up because down the road, when we get into the divided kingdom, there's going to be a call that's going to involve the cherubim and the seraphim, but I get ahead of myself. Capturing the ark was tantamount to capturing Yahweh. And because this ark kept getting captured, and then Israelites would have to go and fight to get it back, the Israelites began to move beyond being comfortable with just judges to protect their interest. And they wanted a king. A king who would be powerful and could lead them into battle against these people that are all around them, that are forever fighting with them. The last of the judges was a man named Samuel. And he would become the first of the prophets. But before we get to that, the desire for a king eventually led to having a king. And it led to a time that's listed on your sheet called the United Monarchy. This was the time of Saul, David, and Solomon. It lasted 100 years. To hear tell of it, it's very easy to think that it was 500, 1,000-year dynasty. 100 years. And let me tell you, it was hardly united. the tribes were still split. All 12 tribes. In the midst of it all, David will emerge, as we'll see next week, as a great king and a model for the rest of the history of Israel. And after Solomon, we will see that there was discontent, and this united kingdom breaks into a divided kingdom. There will be a northern kingdom continuing to be called Israel, and there will be a southern kingdom called Judah. And I'm thinking, you know what, I think I'm going to stop there for questions rather than get started on prophecy, which we will start with next week, because we need to understand prophecy in the history of the Old Testament, because it's going to be very closely tied to the various kings and their good times, their good days, and their bad days. So, we'll stop there. Questions?
So just so you know, you understand why I put 40 and 12? 40 being the years in the wilderness, 12 being the number of tribes in Israel. And how do those numbers come up in the gospel?
The temptation.
The temptation. Jesus in the wilderness, 40 days, 40 nights. How many disciples did he call? What do you think Jesus was doing? Reconstituting Israel. It's not just about calling 12 people, because that's a good way to lead with a small, that good manageable number. It's about reconstituting Israel.
Or the 24 elders in Revelation.
There's 24 elders in Revelation.
This is wired.
I don't know. I'd have to go back and...
But the other, I don't know the answer to that either, to give you a simple answer, but more importantly, Revelation makes numerous references to multiples of 12. So, 144,000 are before the throne of God, and various sort 12, 24, 48, doing various things, fighting and all. So it becomes the foundation for a number of references. Yes, Janet.
Is the gift of land something of a symbol for God's provision for his people? As I'm thinking of how now in modern times Israel is at war protecting their land. And so I'm not seeing the gift of land as a real gift, because it seems to be turned into sin because we're having wars over it.
Isn't that what we do with God's gifts?
Yeah. The land is a gift.
But it's also Yahweh's land. He's the God of the hills, too. I mean, this is his turf. It is claimed as his turf throughout the Old Testament, and certainly in the Psalms, or wherever he tells the other people have seas or something else, but the hills and the whole.
Well, one could also say that when you look at the land that God has, it's not just hills. He seems to have deserts. And what I'm leading up to is the Psalms that say, I look to the hills from whence cometh my help. My help comes from in the name of the Lord. Or you look at, and I can't think of the reference now, but you look at others where they talk about the water burst forth. Well, the water's only bursting forth in dry land. All I'm getting at is when God gives land, he's not always giving us the perfect backyard with the lush green grass and the perfect landscaping and all like that. He's oftentimes giving us the rocky.
You have to go back to the story of creation. Okay, so let's rewind. So God creates Adam and Eve. He elects these people, and he places them in the garden. And I still remember my Old Testament professor saying that the Hebrew for God walking in the garden is like this. God was walking in the garden. Okay,
And it's an earthquake.
I mean, he is present in the garden. So the land and the presence of God are two united symbols that go together. So it isn't just, it's about provision, but it's more than that. And so fast forward to Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob's, the third patriarch, and his, falling, he's in the land of Canaan, and he falls asleep and has a dream. And in the dream, he sees Jacob's ladder, where angels ascending and descending on the land. And then he wakes up and he says, surely this is Bethel, which is why all the synagogues are called Bethel, because it's a house of God. But there isn't a house there, right? So surely this is where God dwells. And to really fast forward, when we get to the Exodus, of course, then the crisis of one of the many spiritual crises is being away from the land.
Get to the exile,
What did I say?
Exodus.
I meant exile. To be taken away from the land was this humongous crisis, but it was also an opportunity for them to realize that God was still God, even in Babylon. It took them a while to come to that realization.
Okay,
I need to remind any of you who have children upstairs that we need to pick them up as soon as possible.